Here we find ourselves on page 278, Variations on the Standard Treatment. Who is resisting? Lacan begins here in the second full paragraph. Who is resisting? The ego, answered the first doctrine, including therein the personal subject, no doubt, but solely from the undiscriminating angle of its dynamics. It is here that the new orientation and technique runs headlong at a lure. A lure here would be like a false bit of food, a false opportunity, and this is, Lacan thinks, the major trip, where the turn towards resistance provokes a mistaken identity as to the source and most important aspect of the subject involved in this resistance, namely the ego. Lacan just doesn't buy it. And he suggests that it's a lure. The ego is a lure, a red herring, if you will. It answers the question in the same way, neglecting the fact that it puts the blame on an ego whose meaning Freud, its oracle, has just changed. So even Freud, the so-called origin of ego-resistant theory, Lacan's pointing out he doesn't even buy the ego as this solid agential force. No, resistance is not the privilege of the ego alone, Lacan continues, building on Freud, but also of the id and the superego. So to even purport that you could isolate an ego as the source of resistance, Lacan says, is contrary to where you claim you're reading that in Freud. Because according to Freud, resistance is something that the id, superego, and ego participate in. So he's saying even at the level of Freud, this association with the ego, your sense of self, your conscious sense of who you are, your me self, doesn't line up. Now, we're moving on here. We're coming back to this issue of who, if not the ego, should we focus on? Nothing else in his last conceptualization, here he's talking about Freud still, will henceforth be truly understood, as can be seen in the fact that the authors of this, quote, turning point wave are still at the stage of examining the death instinct from every angle and even getting bogged down regarding what the subject must properly identify with, the analyst's ego or his superego, without making a single worthwhile step forward, multiplying ever more instead an irresistible misconception. So here he's just really wanting to flag that this is an error. This is a mistake. This turn towards the ego and the ego alone around the issue of resistance is an error, a misstep. Now Lacan wants to try and introduce the corrective, a corrective we were just talking about. But now here on 278, toward the bottom of the page, we see a paragraph by reversing. This is where he's going to try and spell it out. By reversing the correct choice that determines which subject is welcomed in speech, the symptoms constituting subject, namely the unconscious, is treated as if he were constituted, like material, as they say. In other words, the unconscious is mistaken as something that is produced at the level of the symptom, produced by the symptom, when in fact it is the constituting agent of the symptom. While the ego, as constituted as it may be in resistance, notice ego here as constituted, not constituting, becomes the subject upon whom the analyst henceforth calls the constituting agency. So this Lacan is saying is this reversal. There's been a confusion here, a misrecognition. And it basically works like this. The ego is oftentimes mistaken as the agent of one's symptomatic speech, the speaker, if you will, when it's actually the effect of that speech. It's a formation that emerges as a reaction to, and at best a response to, those utterances. And the unconscious is oftentimes mistaken as the effect or the constituted element here, when in fact it's actually the agent. So the unconscious, the parts of us of which we are unaware, conflicts with our parents, conflicts in the past, previous traumas, all those things that we really don't like to think about, all those things that have been repressed, that dwell in the unconscious. These are things that now become agential forces. They're the speakers. They're the ones getting their word in. And the symptomatic speech that pops up when the unconscious speaks produces certain effects. The ego is one of these effects that pops up and is nourished by, even if in a resistive way, to those symptoms. And that's where we're going to head next.